Hi, this is Nancy Yearout, and welcome to my show, High Road to Humanity. In every episode, I tell you powerful true stories filled with great wisdom that you can use in your own life as you strive for a higher road to travel. My featured guests will have their own unique stories to tell that enlighten your mind and your soul. So kick back, relax, and learn the secret to success when you take the high road.
First touch, strong connection, it lays deep in your soul.
Hi, this is Nancy Yearout, and welcome to High Road to Humanity. And I have a fabulous guest today. Dr. Richard Gallagher is here, and welcome to High Road to Humanity. Dr. Gallagher?
Thank you, Nancy, for the invitation.
I'm excited you're here. You guys, if you don't know who he is, let me read a little of his bio. Richard Gallagher is an MD. He's a board-certified psychiatrist. He's a professor of psychiatry at New York Medical and a psychoanalyst at the faculty of Columbia University. He graduated from Princeton University, Phi Beta Kappa, in classics and trained as a resident in psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine. Now, he is the world's foremost scientific expert on the subject of diabolical attacks. He's been an active member of the International Association of Exorcists since the 1990s, and he lives in Westchester, New York. You know, I've never had anybody on the show talk about the demonic. You know, I work with the angels. I bring in a lot of people. I bring in priests. I bring in rabbis. I bring them all in, but I've never had anybody talk about this. And so I'm really glad you're here today. Wouldn't you mind just kind of telling your story? Like, how did this start?
Yeah, I know, Nancy, you have a strong interest in the paranormal and the supernatural. This is a little bit the dark side of the
Yeah,
paranormal.
yeah,
And so it's a little maybe darker show for your audience.
right.
Paranormal is a modern term. And, you know, it's a little bit pseudoscientific in the sense that in the past, people would have called paranormal stuff spiritual, and they would have said there's a good side, a supernatural side to it, and a bad side, often called preternatural. So, you know, for better or for worse, I'd like to think maybe it was a little providential. Many years ago, I was exposed to this sort of darker side as a physician. And I always tell people, I never volunteered for anything. In other words, you know, I mean, I was asked to see some of these cases. I was later asked to write about it. I was asked to write a book. Eventually, you know, I was asked actually by pretty famous Hollywood producer Jason Blum to help him make a movie about some of the book. So, you know, I'd like to think that everything I did was a little bit providential, because I'm not really sure that people should volunteer for this sort of thing.
Yeah, no kidding, right? I want to ask you something really quick before we continue on. Let's back up. At what point did you realize, when you were asked to observe a patient, that it was demonic and it wasn't a mental illness? Like, at what point in your career? I mean, you've been doing this for 25 years. So, I mean, how did you realize? I guess I'm down to the nitty gritty here. You know, you're in your office, somebody has asked you to see a patient. At what point did you realize that this is demonic and it's not a mental illness?
Well, it's a good question, and like a lot of good questions, it has somewhat of a complicated answer. First of all, these are not patients of mine.
Okay.
The people I write about were not patients. You know, I mean, I don't tend to have patients. You know, I'm a very active psychiatrist,
Oh.
Very busy, and I don't tend to have patients who come in and all of a sudden I tell them, surprise, you know, you're possessed. That really doesn't happen. What happens is people seek me out. And the way I got started was a particular priest who, at the time, I mean, it's not that long ago, but at the time, there were very few American Catholic exorcists. You know, it was rare. There are many, many more nowadays. And this guy came to my office, uninvited, but, I certainly was,
Yeah.
pleasant in inviting him in. And he said, Dr. Gallagher, I know you're a Catholic, and I know that you're sort of an academic psychiatrist. So I wonder if I could send you cases that I think have a demonic component. And, also, I'd like you to rule out mental illness in some of these individuals. And I said to him, I had just graduated actually from Yale. I was at that point working for Cornell Medical College. And I said to him, well, look, Father, he was kind of this pleasant but rumpled looking guy. And I said, look, Father, with all due respect, I'm a little skeptical of sort of that stuff, and surprising me, he said, well, then you're the perfect man for the job. In other words, he wanted someone who was kind of skeptical and could rule out making sure that a person didn't have medical or emotional or psychiatric problems.
Right.
And what he did is he sent me, a very good test case of that, because it was a woman from out west, originally Mexican American background. I call her in the book, Demonic Foes, I call her Maria. Whenever I mention anybody's name, it's not their real name, and I don't necessarily say where they're located, but everything else, that I write about is literally 100% accurate. And her story was like a lot of these individual stories. Again, not patients of mine, but people I consulted. And it was very odd, and it was basically that she came with her husband, who was a lovely man, and she told me that especially when she was lying in bed, that she would feel literally beaten up by invisible forces. She had bruises. We did put her through some tests, like a physical exam. We did some blood tests just to make sure that the bruises weren't some
Right.
kind of medical problem. But her story, and corroborated by her husband and even by her friends, was very credible. She was just struck by the fact that this good woman, and she was a good woman, was being literally punched and pummeled by forces that seemed to be invisible. In other words, people would actually watch her being beaten up, and they felt helpless. They couldn't do anything about it.
Okay.
Now, I think, in retrospect, to her credit, she was a very devout, charitable woman, and she believed, this sounds very strange to Americans especially, but not necessarily to a lot of people, including throughout history. She felt that she was actually attacked. She wasn't possessed. She was what we call oppressed.
Okay.
People use different terms, but she felt she was attacked in part because she was actually a very holy person. And she felt that evil spirits may not like her, but she also felt that her theory was that she was cursed by a local kind of, the Spanish term is brujo, for like a sorcerer.
Right. A bruja.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you may be familiar with that term.
I'm in New Mexico. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I took her story for being the truth, and her husband corroborated it. Obviously, I wanted to make sure that she wasn't getting beaten up or something by her husband, but her story was very credible, and basically that's what I said to the priest exorcist. Again, this was not a possession. And, he said, well, thank you, Dr. Gallagher. That's what I suspected. This is what we call not a possession, but an oppression. And he worked with her and a priest in her area. They said some prayers with her. They did what might be called deliverance prayers. And eventually she was 100% cured, but it was a spiritual.
Yeah, and I want to ask you that question. I'm a very spiritual kind of girl, and I've been attacked. It was shocking to me because I didn't realize I was like a little naive on this one. And but I guess I'm like a lot of people, you don't want to think the stuff is out there. You don't want to think that the negative or somebody would actually go to that lengths to make somebody else's life that miserable. And it's really hard to come to grips with. You talk about this in the book, is it real or is it, just, us thinking this? But there is, I mean, I guess after 25 years, there's a dark side.
Well, there absolutely is a dark side, and most historical religions. My book was just translated into Japanese because even in a country like Japan, which is not necessarily a monotheistic country,
Right.
they believe in evil spirits. So, all throughout history, the majority of human beings have believed in evil spirits. In fact, even in America, most people do believe in demons.
Okay.
So the major religions, all kind of believe in this stuff. And, sometimes when people say to me, well, Dr. Gallagher, as a man of science, which I do regard myself, and
Hmm.
as a doctor, which of course I have to be a man of science, how does it feel to be out of the mainstream? And I say, well, what mainstream are you talking about?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
if you're talking about the human race, I'm in the mainstream.
Now, I want to ask you something. Do you find through your research or through your experiences with people who have been possessed that they are religious people?
Not necessarily. I
Okay.
mean, it really can happen to anybody.
Okay.
Now, there are some people who say, well, how come all these stories are about fundamentalist Christians or something?
Hmm.
Actually, nothing could be further from the truth.
Okay.
There was a great German historian who, about 100 years ago, wrote about cases of possession. He was agnostic himself, and he wrote about cases of possession all throughout history and all throughout the world. And the vast majority of cases were non-Christian. In fact, non-Christians sometimes have a more difficult time because they often don't understand what they're undergoing. We in the Catholic Church certainly believe, that demons as fallen angels can possess people. It's
Right.
rare. It's rare. You have to make sure that don't see this in, all over the place. There was when I started out, there was what they call the satanic panic. And there were people with even false memories of this stuff and certainly hysteria about this stuff. To some extent, they're still
Mhm.
in our culture, there still are people who see Satanists everywhere. I don't believe that, but I do feel that I have, for better or for worse, I've had contact with some genuine Satanists and other people who have actually themselves turned to the dark side, which is a very unwise thing to do.
Mhm. Do you worry about the demonic forces coming after you in any respect, or are you just connected with God and you're good?
Well, I never professed to set myself up as some kind of paragon, but I do feel that I'm a little protected. Uh,
Hmm.
I do try to have a healthy spiritual life, and I have a lot of people praying for me. And if I didn't have that, I don't think I would do this work.
Right. I wondered that. Now I have another question. This is really fascinating stuff. Unfortunately, they put the movie out, The Exorcist, which scared people to death. And I wish they wouldn't have done that because it has put a fear into society, which is, a bad thing. But I'm curious, have you been there during an exorcism?
Again, some people mistake when I'm regarded as an expert in this subject, and they say, "Well, are you an exorcist?" I am absolutely not an exorcist.
Right.
I'm a doctor. I happen to be the longest standing American member now because I've outlived everybody else who is a member of the International Association of Exorcists.
Right.
So I've always been sort of a scientific advisor and a medical consultant, but I'm not an exorcist myself.
Right. Have you witnessed the
Uh,
exorcism?
Yes, just as an observer.
Right,
I've witnessed many, many.
okay,
I probably have seen more possessions, which again, I want to stress are not common. Anybody who's seeing possessions all over the place is wrong. But I probably have seen more possessions than any other doctor in the world. My academic chairman, who was a former chairman, who was a believing Catholic, said, because of Zoom and the internet and telephone calls and all that, I've probably seen more of this than any physician in history,
mhm,
which is, in part why I wrote the book. But therefore, I've been invited to
right.
observe many exorcisms, and I have been to a couple of hundred exorcisms.
Well, any commonality between these? Like, do you see any kind of pattern here, or is it just random? As
In
far as the
terms
people who are, possessed, I
of
guess.
attack, yes.
Yeah,
Again, even, I mean, you talked about being subject to something yourself, even good holy people can get attacked by spirits in some way.
mhm,
Possession goes beyond that, though. Usually with a possession, the person, perhaps unwittingly, has somehow invited that in. Now, how does that happen? Doesn't happen to the average person, and the average person shouldn't be all of a sudden afraid that they're going to become possessed or something. What it, what it, what it happens is to people usually who are in two categories. Either people have turned to something very evil, and are engaging in evil, destructive, sinful behavior of a severe degree, or they have turned to the occult,
right,
and they have turned to something, that some people may regard even as a little harmless, but they become involved in some cult or, very esoteric.
dark magic, maybe.
Yes, yeah, like something like that.
Right. I've
And
seen this happen myself, which is crazy. I've had and I won't go into detail, but I've seen it where a person had green eyes and their eyes were dark, and I knew there was something. I'm an empath, and so I knew there was something attached because it wasn't the same person that was there before. And what I feel or what I've seen, and I just want to ask you about this before we go into a couple cases. What I've seen is that the entity attaches itself to the person and it just changes the personality completely.
well, it can, and there's a great variety. I mean, some people are partially possessed, some people are fully possessed, some people go into a trance, some people don't. Some people have, a voice come out of them. Some don't. But there has to be, at least in the Catholic Church, uh, there has to be definite signs of a foreign spirit in
Yeah.
some way. And then the way in which they attack people, even in possessions, is quite varied. But you
Wow.
have to see some signs, you might say, of the paranormal or something so bizarre and odd, that especially to a doctor, this is not
Not
this is
normal.
not mental illness or something. I often tell people, okay, if you believe this is all mental illness, how many mentally ill people do you know who have levitated?
Yeah.
How many mentally ill people do you know who all of a sudden in a trance are speaking perfect Latin? This obviously in these kind of cases, rare as they are, clearly go beyond, mental illness or medical illness.
Right. You guys, the book is Demonic Foes. How long has it been out now, Dr. Gallagher?
It's been out 2 years. It's now been recently translated into several different languages, and also is just out as a paperback. Has a wonderful Audible version.
Awesome.
I actually chose the guy because he's a guy I know who's a Shakespearean actor, and
Ah,
he does a wonderful reading. And so, it's available Amazon, the usual sources.
got it. Listen, would you mind telling us a couple stories? I picked up two stories in your book. I was hoping you'd tell the audience. One is Julia. You call her the Satanic Queen, and it starts out with your own cats fighting in the middle of the night. Can you tell that story, if you don't mind?
Yeah, that was somewhat of a disturbing introduction to her, you might say. This is a woman, again, not her real name, Julia. But, it turned out she was one of these rare Satanists. And the way I first became familiar with her is, the priest wanted me to talk to her. And, I heard a little bit about her, but I hadn't met her yet. And the night before I was to meet her, again, I didn't associate this with her in any way at the time. My wife and I were sleeping, and we had two cats at the time who were well-behaved cats, basically pleasant cats, and they would sleep at the end of our bed. And all of a sudden, they woke us up in the middle of the night, and they were fiercely like two boxers fighting each other and scratching and pawing and screeching. And we were mystified. We wondered if they had eaten something bad or something, who knows. But we had to separate them, and then we went back to bed. And then the next morning, this somewhat to my annoyance, the next morning, this priest who had shown me this original case actually came to my house
Oh,
with
wow.
her. And I later told him, look, please don't bring any more Satanists.
Oh my gosh.
And he apologized, and he said, well, I wanted her, we're concerned about this case. I wanted her to meet you as soon as she got into town here, because she lived about 800 miles away. And I answered the door, and the first thing out of her mouth, I'm going to call her Julia, was, hi, Dr. Gallagher, nice to meet you. By the way, how did you like those cats last night? And I was
That's creepy.
creepy, and I was ticked off.
Yeah.
I later told her, look, you're supposed to see me, not as a patient, but to be evaluated further. And if you pull something like that again, I mean, I'm not going to see you anymore.
Right.
And she actually enjoyed talking to me. It was a pro bono consultation, and I met her a number of times, and it was a unique opportunity, not only to learn about her case, but to learn about her cult, which is, these cults are sometimes exaggerated, but, they usually try to remain shrouded in mystery. So I learned a lot about this whole field from her. This was actually an early case, and it was what was described by the two exorcists who were involved with her, which I describe in the book. They were, called it a once-in-a-century case, which is why, I mean, actually, the Hollywood producer, Jason Blum, got interested in he's going to make a movie about this.
She's one of the reasons, is what you're saying.
Yeah, because it's such a dramatic story, Nancy. Obviously, if you're going to make a film, you would pick this case because it is an incredible dramatic case.
Now, as we talk about this, and as you met with these people, I'm really into energy and the energetics of it all. And I feel like, people get into these cults and they work with the energy, and because you can manipulate it. Have you come across that aspect of it, the energetics of it all?
Well, I understand what you mean by energy. I mean, I'm a little skeptical about using that word. I mean, these are demonic forces, and they're not neutral energies. They're real demons who, real entities, creatures, you might say, who have rejected God, have chosen their own,
Path.
their own path, their own selfishness. And I mean, Julia herself, as a committed devil worshiper, I mean, she worshipped Satan, and she felt that Satan gave her psychic gifts. And when I said to her, "Do you think you're gifted in some way?" She goes, "No, I'm not gifted. This isn't some energy. This is something, not some energy that comes from me. It's I have these psychic abilities, because Satan has given me these gifts.
Right, that's my point. You see, when I'm a psychic, so when I bring in the light, which I do every day, I pray and I bring in the light of God and I run it through my body and I bring it up through the earth. So that's how I have claircognizance. I'm able to, but I get my messages from God. So she's getting her messages from the demonic, which is some scary stuff, right?
It was scary stuff, and yet at the same time, she was in this cult. She was sort of in love with the cult leader. She was the high priestess. She was very committed to Satan, and yet she herself, she was smart enough to know that she had gotten possessed. So she wanted to sort of have her cake and eat it too.
Ah, gotcha. Okay,
She
okay.
wanted to be relieved of the possession, but she didn't really want to renounce the cult. And if I said to her once, I said to her 100 times, I said, Julia, you can't have it both ways. This is not going to work. You can have 1,000 exorcisms. It's not going to work. And people often have a Hollywood version of exorcisms, like it's some kind of magic, witch doctor prayer.
Right, right.
The person has to work at it. They have to renounce any evil or occult ties in their life. And unfortunately, she, never did that. And
Oh, she never did.
No, and she was never delivered.
Wow. Interesting. Have you ever seen an entity leave one of the bodies during the exorcism? Have you ever seen the energy go?
Well, again, I would call it an actual demon that leaves.
Have you seen the demon go to the light?
I mean, I wouldn't, I have never seen a demon.
Okay.
I have heard in many exorcisms, the demons speak through. That's what a possession is, speaking through the body and even using the vocal cords of the individual. So
Mhm.
I've heard many demonic utterances. I mean, one of the more dramatic ones, I was driving in the car with the priest, and Julia was in the back. He was sort of arranging, a place for her exorcism, and all of a sudden, Julia went into a trance, and said, the demon was at that point talking not to me but to the priest who was driving. He was not a great driver, so I was
Oh no.
hoping he didn't get distracted. But the demon said, I'm not going to try to imitate it, but it was in effect using her vocal cords in a guttural way, and said, listen, you effing priest, you'll be sorry. I told you, we'll never leave, and you effing monkey priest, calling the priest a monkey, which I think is a fair indication of how evil spirits feel about us. I mean, they believe we're just sort of, stupid animals compared to their intelligence.
Interesting.
Yeah. And now that was a creepy thing. Later, I mean, there were a couple of other creepy things that happened. This was early on in my, witnessing this sort of stuff. And, I guess I've gotten a little professionally calm about seeing it.
Say, are you lax about it now, Dr. Gallagher?
I wouldn't exactly say relax, but it's not quite so strange to me.
Yeah.
I remember one time that I had a particularly creepy experience. We knew that Julia had gone home, and again she lived about 800 miles away, so it's not like she was in on this conversation. It was a landline, and I called the priest. Well, the priest called me and asked me if I wanted to come to the exorcisms. I never actually did. I was a busy family man and
Right.
professional, professor of psychiatry. So, I didn't really have time to travel at the time to her exorcisms. However, I'm talking to the priest about, when he was going to schedule the exorcism, and all of a sudden that same voice came in over the phone and said, we told you, again, addressed to the priest, we told you, you stupid priest, leave her alone. You'll really regret this. And, I was taken aback. I mean, I just wanted to make sure that he was hearing the same thing.
Oh,
And
gosh.
he was the calm one on the phone conversation, because he says, yes, Rich, I told you this is a remarkable once in a century case. So, these things can happen in these cases. It was, Nancy, it was literally the only time in my life where, you hear about the hairs on the back of your neck going up.
Yeah.
Literally, the hairs on the back of my neck went up.
Wow.
That's probably the most creepy experience I
Creepy
had.
experience.
But I had many other experiences with her. I mean, once she told me that she could see, there were two exorcists, she could see the other exorcist, she could just see the other exorcist. It's what parapsychologists sometimes call remote viewing.
Right.
That's been reported. You're probably familiar with that, because I know
Yes.
you're familiar with, a number of these paranormal abilities.
Mhm.
And what she had told me this about several people, and I was going to challenge her. So, I had enough of a relationship with her at that point. She kind of trusted me. She trusted doctors. I think she trusted doctors more than priests.
For the priest,
So
yeah.
I said, well, look, Julia, Miss, I called her Miss Smarty Pants. Look, Miss Smarty Pants. Uh, okay, so describe him if you can see him. And I knew where he was. He lived about 100 miles from where I was at the time,
Right.
even though he was involved in this case. And, he lived in a residence, a rectory, and, normally he would have been in his rectory. So I said, okay, so you describe him. And again, I describe all these things in the book. She said, well, he's walking along the beach. Now, I know he lived near a body of water. I'm a little careful not giving too many details.
Right. Right.
But he's walking by the water, and he's saying his mumbo jumbo prayers. Now, by that she meant, it was a disparaging comment, but she meant that he was saying his breviary, which Catholic priests usually say what's called the divine office every day. And I said, what is he wearing? And she said he has a windbreaker on, a blue windbreaker, and he has his khakis. So I said, okay, I'm going to call him. So, I mean, I was speaking to her directly at that point. And I took my cell phone and I called him and I said, Father Ray. He called himself Father Ray. Again, that's not his real name. It was kind of his nom de guerre. It was kind of the name he liked to use
Right.
with the public, because he wanted a certain amount of privacy. And I said, Father Ray, obviously I knew what his name was. He was a friend of mine by that point. I said, Father Ray, what are you doing? And he said, Rich, who wants to know? I said, just humor me for a while. I would like to find out what you're doing.
I had a feeling. Okay.
He said, well, I normally would be at the rectory, but today I took a little drive. I went to the sound, and I'm walking along the beach. And I said, and what are you wearing? And what are you doing? And what are you wearing?
Mhm.
He said, I'm wearing a windbreaker. What color? Blue. I'm saying my divine office. And it dawned on him, because he was a very experienced exorcist. This guy may have been the most experienced exorcist that America has ever had. He was very, very knowledgeable. And the Satanist I know hated the guy. And he said, I know what's going on. I said, what? He said, you're talking to Julia, right? And I said, yes. And I remember him saying to me something to the effect, she's a remarkable case, isn't she, doctor? So, I mean, Julia had these abilities during the exorcisms. She did have some exorcisms. The priests were willing to do that. They would try to work with her ambivalence. And even though, again, I didn't go to the exorcisms, Nancy, about 8 people sort of salted the earth people, a couple of nuns, some lay people, as well as the 2 priests, all reported to me, because I was sort of involved in still talking to her.
Mhm.
And they said that, all kinds of, I mean, the way the exorcists describe it, all hell broke loose, I mean, sometimes the room became hot, sometimes it became frigid. She was struggling against those restraining her, which she had agreed to being restrained, uh, restraining her with all her might for like hours in a way that seemed superhuman. She spoke all kinds of foreign languages, including Latin. And then, most dramatically, and I've heard this from about 35 people in my life, although I've never witnessed one, they said for about a half an hour during the exorcism, she levitated. She rose out of the chair where she was being held down. There were a couple of nurses there, and they said to me, Rich, she would have gone to the ceiling if we didn't hold her down.
Wow.
She was actually suspended in air for about a half an hour. And
But
again, it's not,
she was never cured, really. I mean, she never really said, I believe in God. So she never moved forward. She's still in this state. Is that right? Or is she still with us? Or
well, what she said to me actually, apropos of your question, she said to me, Satan, I know he gives me favors. This God, I don't understand this God you believe in. But more importantly, she just refused to renounce, her nefarious ways and the cult. So
no.
she was never delivered. About a year after she was the one who stopped the exorcisms, and I was kind of warning the priest, look, you really, she's not cooperative. Um, about a year later, I got a call from the priest, and he said, well, she wants to resume.
Mm.
And so I called her because I was, again, expected to assess her and certainly her health. And she said to me she was dying of cancer. And I said, well, look, Julia, exorcisms is a little taxing. Uh, I know you want to resume the exorcisms, but, we have to check out your health. And you have to give me the name of your oncologist. And she goes, well, I'll think about that. And then we never heard from her again. So the feeling was that she died, although I don't absolutely know that for a fact. She may show up at some point.
That's crazy. Thanks for telling us that. How does your wife feel about all this?
I don't really get into that, Nancy, because I have had people close to me. I mean,
Yeah.
it's for a
Yeah.
serious reason. I've had people close to me threatened. And so
Oh, okay. I see.
I don't like to talk about any
Yeah.
any
Personal.
pers- personal threats that have been made.
I
But
can accept that. Yes, I get it.
they have been made.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. Are
I know
you,
it's a natural question. I just don't like to talk publicly about
I understand.
anybody else but myself.
Now, you say you're Catholic. Have you become obviously more religious over the years?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was brought up Catholic. I had, like most young people, questioned it for a while, and uh,
Hmm.
had my share of doubts for a while. I do think this certainly brought me back to what I think is a deeper understanding of the faith.
I bet. Would you mind telling us one more story before we get out of here today? Would that be okay?
Well, I got a million stories. I mean, I think you talked about mentioning Catherine.
Catherine. Yeah.
There's one other case that, if we have time, I think you would also find fascinating. Catherine was a housewife, and as a young girl, she had been involved with sort of, dark rituals, let's call it that,
Okay.
and she became possessed. And one major peculiarity of her possession, and all the possessions are a little bit different, but one major, I talked about Maria being physically attacked.
Hmm.
Catherine felt more attacked in her mind and in her senses in a way that I'll explain in a moment. And that's what you might call an internal oppression. People use different terms here. So now she was also physically attacked as well, but prominently she had this distorted imagination and senses. So, you know, she felt she got messages. Now, again, they weren't like a psychotic person, they weren't hallucinations, but she also felt that her senses were affected. By that, I mean, she felt that she couldn't hear things, but it was very selective. So I remember saying to her when I first met her, Catherine, you know, did you go to the store this morning? And she was perfectly coherent. She had gone shopping for food. She was actually a good cook. I
Yeah.
sampled some of her food. And, you know, she said, yeah, Dr. Gallagher, I bought some, you know, potatoes and some pork. And and then I said to her, and did you pray today? And she looked at me like, huh? You know, did you go to church today? And she looked at me like, huh? So she could have a normal conversation, but she couldn't hear anything that was of a religious nature. And the point, you know, I was convinced, and even more importantly, the people working with her, exorcists, for instance, were convinced, is that it was the demons were blocking her hearing, so she couldn't receive any spiritual advice. And I remember at a second visit when I visited them, and I did observe the exorcisms as well. I went with a psychiatric colleague of mine, and you know, when we were driving to her home, which was, you know, a trek, we came up with the bright idea. Okay, she can't hear that sort of thing. Let's write it on a piece of paper.
Oh, okay.
So when we got there, you know, she was in her usual state, and you know, I wrote on a piece of paper, Catherine, again, not her real name. Catherine, what did you do this morning? And, you know, she said, well, you know, they had a pickup truck. I said, she said, oh, you know, I had to put gas in the pickup truck. And then we put another question to her, have you been able to pray? Do you, you know, are you trying to turn to our Lord? And she looked at me sort of with a hurt look, and she said, Dr. Gallagher, why are you showing me a blank piece of paper? So it was not only her hearing that had been blocked about this sort of thing.
It was her sight.
It was her sight as well at that point,
Yeah.
you know, and very selectively. Now, there have been other cases of possessions where somebody, has their hearing blocked totally. And when you do organic tests on them, you know, there's nothing wrong with their hearing except it's being blocked by demonic forces.
It's crazy. There was one more story you wanted to tell us.
Well, I think this may be, you know, I mean, I'm speculating, but I think it may be of interest to your audience. There was a woman, I think I call in the books Sarah, and she was a very devout, holy person, actually, you know, wonderful homemaker, took care of a lot of people. And she came to me because she claimed that she was getting messages from angels. Now, again, people send people to me because, you know, they want to make sure she's not schizophrenic or something. I mean, she had submitted to another doctor giving her medication. She said it didn't do anything. You know, I still hear the voices, and it wasn't like a kind of a psychotic or dissociative disorder type of thing, which are some of the conditions I have to rule out. It's not like she was hearing it in her ears, you know. She was hearing. She felt. She said she was hearing it in her mind.
In her
Like
mind.
it was a message, and I remember saying to her, it's almost like what people call telepathy, and she goes, yeah, that's exactly right. And I said, what are the angels telling you? And she said, well, they're giving me this great mission to tell God's message to the world. And I said, so what do you think of that? She goes, well, I don't buy it. I don't know what's happening to me, but I don't think angels are appearing to me. She's a very humble person. And she said, I certainly don't think I would be chosen to give a great message to the world. And I said, well, you know, that shows a certain amount of common sense and humility. Why don't you pray about it and work with the priest about it and come back in a month and tell me what's happened? And she came back in a month and she said, Dr. Gallagher, you were right. There has been a change. And now they're telling me that they're dead souls. That dead souls are giving me messages. And I said, well, what do you think of that? And she goes, well, I'm a little skeptical. I know that, in the Bible, we're not supposed to communicate with dead souls. That was her reading of Deuteronomy, for instance. And she said, so I really don't know what's going on. She goes, I do wonder if it's something dark. And I said, well, keep praying, keep working with the priest, and come back in another month. And she came back in the third month and she said, Dr. Gallagher, I think you suspected this, but they have finally admitted who they are. They're demons. And, they've just been, disguising themselves as either dead souls or angels. And that happens, Nancy. You may be aware of that yourself, that evil spirits can pretend there are a lot of things, including, dead souls or even angels.
Yeah. Well, yeah, unfortunately, I've learned to protect myself every day because, connect with God every day. And I'm protected, and I call in Archangel Michael, and I call in my family of angels and ask them to surround me with white light. And, and you have to have a positive attitude. And it sounded like she did have a positive attitude, but she knew they were around her. Did they do an exorcism on her?
Well, again, she wasn't, strange as it sounds, she
She
wasn't
wasn't
possessed.
possessed.
This was another type of oppression. So certainly, the priest that she was working with did prayers with her, and she intensified her own spiritual practices, and which is an integral part of the process. You can't just expect it's going to happen because somebody says a few prayers over you. You have to work at it, and eventually, it all went away.
It all went away. As you were saying that, I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting because it deepened her faith in God.
Yeah, she had a pretty strong faith in the beginning, but I think
Yeah.
it must have intensified. It must have intensified. Sure.
Yeah. Now, I just want to ask, you have people from all over the world who contact you. Do you work with people through Zoom? If there's somebody in the audience who would like to contact you, are they able to? Is there a website you can give out, or how do they contact you?
Well, there is information on the internet about contacting me. I must say that, I have to set some limits on that because, I already get a lot of referrals. Again, these are not patients, so I'm doing consultations, but I get a lot of referrals from clergy, and I have to prioritize that. I prefer if people contact me, they already have a clergy person involved because I'm not an exorcist. So, it's better if they have somebody who can help them.
Okay.
And, look, Nancy, there's 24 hours in a day. I'm already a full-time psychiatrist and a very busy professor at 3 different institutions. So now I'm also executive producer on this movie. So
Wow.
I would say that, I mean, I regret in a way, but unfortunately, I do have to, turn down a fair amount of people that I can't help everybody. I don't have a messianic
You don't
complex.
have, yeah. I will say I have to commend you for putting this together and doing this work because this information really does need to be brought to the forefront. People really have a misunderstanding of demonic possession. I think this helps clear a lot of things up and answer a lot of questions for people.
Well, thank you for recognizing that. And then again, recognizing that I can only see so many people.
Mhm.
I wrote the book. I was asked to write
Sure.
the book, and that's why I wrote the book. Not only to help people like that, and even some exorcists have told me that they find the book helpful. But in addition, I talk about people with false memories and that sort of thing. So you have to be careful in your diagnosis. But also, the educated public, probably people who listen to you, or often searching for sober answers to this. And there's so much nonsense out there.
Mhm.
There are people who write books, Nancy, you may be aware of this, and they just make up stories about demons.
Well,
Uh,
yeah.
it's kind of disgusting. So I tried to write a book. It's a serious book. HarperCollins allowed me to write the type of book I wanted. but I do tell a lot of these stories, but I also make a lot of serious points. And, I wrote the book also for the educator public.
Yeah, and you're really helping people. Thank you for coming on. I hope you come back.
Well, invite me back and I will.
Okay.
It was a pleasure talking to such a thoughtful person.
Oh,
Okay.
God bless. You guys, his book is called Demonic Foes. It's by Dr. Richard Gallagher, MD. You guys, and I'm going to get out of here for today, but I do appreciate you coming on the show and sharing all those stories with us. Thank you. You guys, this is Nancy. You're out. This is High Road to Humanity. Everybody have a fabulous week and God bless. Please join me next time on the High Road with stories full of love and hope for our future. You can find High Road to Humanity on TogiNet Radio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and now watch the High Road on Binge TV networks. My channel is High Road to Humanity. Have a blessed week and know by staying on the High Road, you will make it to your destination. For a psychic empath reading, visit my website, nancyyearout.com, to book your date and time with me. I will deliver your messages from the angels, and God bless.